Welcome again to the Working Class Movement Library's Invisible Histories Talks, where today we're particularly wishing you a happy LGBT plus History Month. We're really pleased to have as our speaker Ray Woolford, who'll be talking to us about Scottish activist Kath Duncan, who was involved at the highest level in campaigns such as the 1920s hunger marches and the fight against Oswald Mosley's fascists, and whose extraordinary life was almost lost to history prior to Ray's book about her, The Last Queen of Scotland. The library's events are, as usual, free. However, we would like to encourage you to support the library if you're able to do so, and there's a donate button on our website. Okay, over to you, Ray. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lynette, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It's not very often that people on the left, particularly on the LGBT section, have a chance to have this platform. So I'm very grateful for the Working Class Movement Library for giving me this platform today. And I'm really grateful for all of you for actually taking an hour of your time to actually listen to the story about this extraordinary woman. But first, I really wanted to talk about sort of LGBT history generally. When I was planning this talk, I got a text from somebody that said, what's the point of LGBT History Month? You know, after all, you know, queers are all over the TV, and who doesn't like Kylie and Boy George? And it really got me thinking, because although this was sort of one person's view, and it wasn't actually written in malice, it was one that sort of made me think about it at the time with Black Lives Movement and our general perception about history and rethinking history and who tells our history, and the statues debate and others. And so when I was thinking about it, I was thinking, well, there is some truth in that. Many left-wing publications have their own agenda. For example, with Kath Duncan and her ally, Fred Copeman, they were very key communists. But because they were communists, a lot of people will not talk about them, because even today, being a communist isn't cool. So I'm talking today not as a communist, I'm more of an anarchist than a communist, but really that the importance of people in history, particularly women in history, needs to be told. And how do we define queer women? How do we define what makes a working class woman a hero or a heroine? What makes them worthy? And I just want to touch on a few people that you may or may not be aware of. So I'm going to start with Charlotte Hughes. Charlotte Hughes is a single mum, Ashton-under-Lyne. Since Universal Credit came into place, she's run a food bank at her job centre and spent 5 years highlighting the misery and the impact of Universal Credit. Is she a queer hero? To me, she's a queer hero. There's also Ruth. Some people would know her in the Northeast. Ruth has done an extraordinary job campaigning against the impact of poverty, particularly on young women with period pads. So the period campaign, period poverty, has been really highly focused by Ruth. Ruth has ensured that in Scotland, they now have access to free sanitary towels. And so Ruth, although I'm a man, Ruth is also a queer hero, I would argue, and a working class hero, because what she's done for young women everywhere. And then I'd also point out that working class heroes should also include somebody like Paula Peters. Paula Peters is an activist with disability. She was the first woman to actually turn the disabled people into a movement. And when you saw the streets of Westminster being blocked, when you saw the lobby of Westminster by people in wheelchairs, it was Paula Peters that mobilized disabled people to get out of the bedroom and onto the street, and gave them a political party, a political movement, a voice that they never had before. She showed that even with a wheelchair, even if you're bedridden, with the power of your phone, you can be an activist. So to me, Paula, through her work with the disability movement, is also a working class hero, because at the end of the day, queer people, gay people, lesbian people, trans people are also have universal credit issues. They have disability issues. They have children or themselves with issues around period poverty. And then getting closer to what the subject matter is today is, how could we forget Carol Ann Grayson? And Carol Ann Grayson, I would argue, in the age of the pandemic, is one of the most important women that we should be aware of today. Carol Ann Grayson was the first AIDS nurse in Britain, the first one. She lost both her husband, her brother-in-law, and her father in the blood transfusion crisis in the NHS. The public inquiry, which is happening today, is happening a direct consequence of 30 years of activism of Carol. Carol was the one before Princess Diana that was shaking the hands of people with AIDS. And I think to a certain extent, Carol, to most people, should be a working class hero. She's a queer hero to me because of her work with AIDS, but her work on challenging the corporations and what was going on with the blood transfusion scandal makes her a working class hero and somebody we should all be aware of and extremely proud of, this woman in our society that never gave up, that paid a terrible price, the loss of 3 members of the family, but actually overall won the argument that led to the biggest public inquest that we've had in the NHS. So all power to Carol, it's a name we should all be aware. But of course, other people in our history play a smaller part. And what we seem to forget is that a lot of people, particularly women in history, are famous for different aspects of history. Some people are famous for being a suffragette, you know, Octavia Hill, the National Trust, you know, some of the people for flying planes. There's lots of different aspects to women's history where women are very easy to be signposted, to be put in a position of a set box, you know, like, you know, Florence Nightingale, the NHS. So I think that what we sometimes forget is that working class women go beyond their stereotype and their imagery and are more powerful than that. And so the first one I briefly wanted to talk about was somebody that probably most people don't know, is Felicia Brown. And Felicia Brown was probably the first well-known, at the time, trans woman. She lived in Kath Duncan's house in New Cross in southeast London in the 1930s. And she passed herself off as a man. And she was actually the only British woman killed fighting the Spanish Civil War. Women were not allowed, British European women were not allowed to fight in the Spanish Civil War. But Felicia Brown passed herself off as a man, lived as a man, and fought on the front line. And it was only because rescuing a comrade who was shot and carrying him off the battlefield, and with 11 bullets in her body, that it was discovered when they dressed her body ready for burial, that what they thought was a man was actually Felicia. And so Felicia died on the front line, giving her life for democracy and the cause she believed in. But again, she was a communist and a queer communist. And I really think that, you know, we have lots of different heroes, but I think Felicia gave her life. She was an ordinary woman that gave her life. And she's been forgotten in history because of her LGBT status, because she came from a poor background, and because she didn't fit the tick box of politics that we live in today. And so I think Felicia Brown is also a really important working class woman that should have something that celebrates who she is, what she achieved, and the power of women in solidarity. So I think she's quite an extraordinary woman. And then I really sort of come back to the original thing when I was saying that the problem with LGBT History Month is that some people have issues with it. People think, oh, we've won the battle, it's over. But around the world, there's still 70 countries around the world in which being queer is still a criminal act. And even today, when I'm giving you this talk, I looked at my local community to see who was doing stuff for LGBT History Month. And it did shock me that still very, very few churches of any persuasion actually take any role, positive or otherwise, in the LGBT History Month. And I think that's really, really tragic. And I'll give you a really, really good example was that when I wrote my book, when I started on my journey with Kath Duncan, it really came around by accident. I didn't know she was gay when I started the journey. What happened was I was running the largest independent food bank in London, in Southeast London, and I needed money to fund our food bank. So I started a local heritage festival, in part to encourage people to take a sense of identity in their communities to the backdrop of gentrification. So I wanted people to feel empowered by their history, by their working class history. And so I started this heritage festival to fund the food bank. And while I was doing the food bank, I came across this name, Kath Duncan. And it intrigued me. It was written, there was only one article online written about her by the columnist George Stevenson. It wasn't accurate, but it was enough to actually get me off my backside and to do some research. And I spent 5 years researching Kath Duncan. I went to Scotland to find out more about her. And while I was there, everybody said, this is such an amazing woman. You should write a play. Somebody should write a play. So I thought, yeah, I'm going to write a play. I'm dyslexic. I've never written anything in my life. But yeah, I'm going to write something, because if I don't write it, who will write it? Who will know the story? So I spent 5 years writing the biography of the last Queen of Scotland. And during that, I wrote the play Liberty. And why that's relevant today is that when I wrote this play Liberty, I wanted to write a play that was written from a working class perspective. So Kath Duncan in the 30s was in a theatrical group called the Red Blouse Theatre Company. And it was just working class women which did a terrible job at acting, but they would go to rallies and meetings and they would tell the working class stories in a bit like, you know, sort of medieval times when they had sort of, you know, Shakespearean type of events, but this was more working class. And so Kath Duncan was very much in my mind with the play. When I was thinking about play, I wanted something that didn't need a stage, didn't cost a lot of money to stage, and anybody could do, whether it's in their church hall, in their street, in their school playground. So when I wrote the play, I thought, where's the logical place to stage it? And I looked around and I looked at community centres, they didn't quite work. And so I then approached churches, and I thought, well, church halls have the echo, they have the sounding, they have the seating, they have the disability access. It's a good place to start. And so I approached one church, one of my big local churches, and said, I want to stage my play Liberty about Kath Duncan and how the civil rights movement started in Britain in your church as part of the LGBT History Month. Immediately it was blocked on the grounds that, you know, the church didn't really want to be openly seen to be supporting LGBT History Month. And this is in 2019. A church is refusing me access to the community space on the basis that it did not want to be seen to be promoting the church, okay, gay rights. Bizarrely, another church, not particularly well known for supporting gay rights, a Baptist church, agreed to stage my play. And the play was staged as part of the LGBT History Month in February 2019. It won high acclaim and was a huge success. After the play had run its course for 3 weeks, I met the pastor and his wife in Deptford Market. And I said to them, thank you for staging the play. It was, you know, really kind of you. It was a difficult struggle, and I know it's not easy for the church to support this sort of project. And then I was mortified to discover that my pastor and his wife had had a visit from a delegation of other Baptist church telling them that they would have to stop the church production, i.e. my play Liberty, with immediate effect, or they would face exclusion from the Baptist Alliance of Churches. And what surprised me even more was that my pastor, who'd had a nervous breakdown as a direct consequence of this pressure, had actually stood by my play and staged my play regardless of the bullying and the impact it had on his church. And that's 2019. And I just wanted to share it with you because a lot of people still think that gay rights has won. And it's still a struggle. Yes, we're on the TV. Yes, we have an element of rights. We can get married. I can now celebrate having a civil partnership with my husband, whereas my first husband died of AIDS, and I couldn't even go to his funeral or be at his bedside because as a gay man, I had no rights. And so we have progressed in that way, but we've still got so long to go. And I wanted to share those stories with you about the struggles, because when I raised the issue of Kath Duncan with gay and LGBT media, their view has consistently been with Kath Duncan and other campaigns. I work with refugees, I work with poverty, I work with the homeless, is that gay people are not political, they're not interested. Most of my work around LGBT History Month is broadcast globally. In the UK, if I was doing something very superficial like Love Island or Celebrity in the Jungle, whoever I worked with would be front page news. But even in the UK press today, I struggle to get the stories of LGBT told in our media, whether it's the fact that a quarter of all homeless in Britain are LGBT+, whether the trial and tribulation of being a lesbian or gay or trans person refugee in Europe can be life and death, but nobody wants to talk about it. And about those heroes we have, like Kath Duncan, like Felicia, who have done so much, have given their lives to our cause, who aren't even worth as much as a mention as part of their local heroes when they talk about women, International Women's Day, when they talk about LGBT history, or when they talk about Pride. So even in Pride, which is now corporate, we now have Reclaim Pride, which is about trying to reclaim the heritage and the history of our people and our people's stories. And I find it extraordinary that all of you here will know about the civil rights movement of South Africa. You will know the history of America. You will know the civil rights history of India. And yet the queer civil rights history of Great Britain is still not taught. It's still not celebrated. And the only recognition Kath Duncan has, and that's only as a direct consequence of my book, is a park bench in Deptford by the children's play area. And now she has a Wikipedia page. And to get her story told in the UK, I struggled. I had to go to New York to get a publisher because I was told that queer women don't sell books. I was told I couldn't stage my play in London because all the theatres were saying there's no market for queer women. There's no audience. Queer people don't buy theatre tickets about other women. And so I proved them wrong by staging it myself. Hundreds of people bought tickets. And I still struggle to get my play touring the UK. I know we have COVID at the moment, but after COVID, we should have theatres queuing up to say we want this story told. We want every Pride festival, not just to be about Barclays Bank and everybody, corporations waving their flags about what they do for LGBT, but we actually want the heritage and those that have fought the struggles. Some of you are watching It's a Sin on TV. It's great that we actually have something at last that touches on a really devastating part of our history. But there's also lots of history before that. Stonewall is always seen as the foremost, the most important aspect to the LGBT civil rights movement, Stonewall. Even our organizations in the UK are called Stonewall. And yet some of the biggest movements, and the biggest movement led by Kath Duncan was in Deptford. And I really want to sort of now focus on Kath Duncan and her story. Kath Duncan was born on the 4th of July in 1988 in Scotland. She was raised by a mother who was a seamstress. She had a sister, and her father was a merchant. He died at the age of 5. She was really quite an extraordinary woman in so many levels. She was only 5'2" tall. She was very shy. She had beautiful red hair, piercing blue eyes, and she had an amazing sense of fashion. So her mother would dress her like, you know, the Hollywood icons of the 1920s. So as a young woman, she was extremely glamorous, and you could not notice who she was. And she won a scholarship to Dundee University. She became a primary school teacher. And her best friend that she met in Edinburgh was Clementine Churchill, before Clementine Churchill married Sir Winston Churchill. That was quite interesting because Clementine Churchill at this time, the reason she was in Edinburgh is she'd been found in the bins around Dieppe because she was so poor. She'd been going through the bins in France to survive, and a family member saw her and they took her to Edinburgh where they had family members who would support her and make sure she had a decent meal a day to eat. And through that, they got actively involved in the suffragette movement. And Kath Duncan started as a young woman, actively involved with the Scottish civil rights movement through the suffragette movement. And what really sort of shaped her politics was, as a primary school teacher, she could read and write. And so she started to read the letters from the war front, because not everybody could read and write. And she would help people write letters to the war front. And she would see the impact of the First World War, where in some of her villages, the entire men would sign up to go to war in the First World War. And because they were all grouped together in one group, when that group was killed, the entire male population of one village was wiped out at once. And that really, really shaped her politics and the injustice of it all, and really sort of mobilized her in a way that it shaped her sense of social justice. And at the time, of course, she was involved with the independent Labour movement. The Communist Party didn't exist really until 1920. So at this time, she was very raw, but very real and very well educated and very articulate. And although she was very shy, she joined the Amateur Dramatic Society so that would give her confidence to actually do her speeches and to reach out to people on so many different levels. In 1906, it was very rare, but she went to the wedding of Clementine and Sir Winston Churchill. So for a lay person, which would, should technically seen as poor, to go to a wedding of that importance was quite something. And it was quite extraordinary that even to this day, at the time of the Second World War, every wedding photograph of Kath Duncan and anything to do with that wedding has vanished from the archives. There's no recorded photographs since the Second World War of Kath Duncan. And I think we'll come back to that as to why later in my talk. In 1917, there was a by-election in Dundee, and women weren't really allowed to be political in the sense of they couldn't hold real political office. And Sir Winston Churchill needed to be brought back into government. And there was a by-election. The by-election was caused when the present MP was given a seat in the House of Lords. He stood down. The government wanted Sir Winston Churchill in the government. And so 1917, there was a by-election. But Sir Winston was so busy with other things, he didn't have time to campaign in Scotland. And so his wife, Clementine, who absolutely loathed Tories, which was why her and Kath Duncan were such close friends, suggested that Kath Duncan lead his campaign in Dundee. And so Kath Duncan ended up her first taste of political activism. She fought his campaign, organised it, went to the factory gate, stood on lorries, created platforms. And Sir Winston Churchill won the 1917 by-election with 87% of the vote. Quite extraordinary. And she was, in all but name, his political campaign manager, his election agent. She did everything. She got out the vote for Sir Winston Churchill. At that time, it was, the Liberal politics, and it was all about getting the Tories out. So there was a united left front. What was quite telling about this, that, a few years later, when Kath Duncan had moved and was no longer fighting Dundee, the same seat was won back by the person who lost it by 87% by 20%. So that 80% majority was clearly had a huge impact as a direct consequence of Kath and the power of her word. In 1923, in December, she married in the Kirkcaldy tea rooms Sandy Duncan, who was another teacher. Sandy was gay. He was a PA instructor in the school, and they were the most glamorous couple really in their area. They were beautiful, articulate, fun, well-connected. But at that wedding, this was really when I got the first clue that things were not as they seemed. The only people that went to their wedding was 2 witnesses, and not even Kath's mother. And although Kath was an atheist, her mother was deeply religious throughout her whole life. If that was a genuine marriage, Kath Duncan's mother would have gone to that marriage. So in 1924, Sandy moved to London, to Hackney, to find them housing. And she got involved with the Emily Daisy, the Pankhurst group of women in Hackney. And they became really high profile with the suffragette movement in London, and that sort of freedom that working class women had in London that they didn't have necessarily in the suburbs. So the main reason why Kath Duncan and Sandy gave up good jobs, good housing, and all their friends was their gender. You know, moving to London as gay people, it was a lot easier than being gay in Scotland. It was very conservative, and they wanted to have a freer life. And so they moved to Hackney, got involved with the women's movement. And at first, Kath Duncan wasn't too keen on the communist movement. She was, you know, suffragette. She'd been actively involved in the independent labour movement. And the other women like Daisy Lansbury and others were very committed to try and get her to play a more active role in direct actions. And then the general strike came on 1926, by which time all of her women friends were actively involved in the communist market, in the communist movement. And Kath Duncan joined the communist movement. And one of the things she was most proud of was that she went, and her role during the 1926 strike was ensuring no buses and trams would run. And so she mobilized the entire Hackney tram and bus network to join the general strike. And so no trams and no buses worked in Hackney. And as a direct consequence of that, Kath Duncan was hailed as the first working class hero of that time. She then went on building up through different social justice, slum housing, other activism. And as she built her confidence, it was decided that she should move to another area. All the great activist women were all in Hackney. There was other issues happening. The suffragette votes were beginning to change. People were diversifying into other social justice campaigns. And Kath Duncan wasn't just about single issues. She hated poverty. She hated social injustice in all its forms. And so she wanted to be more active in other roles. So in 1930, she moved to Deptford. And in Deptford, in 20 Ormond Road, in New Cross, in Telegraph Hill area, she set up a house that all the police reports of the time said it was full of revolutionaries and deviants, which is what we called gay people at the time. And for Kath, it was an extraordinary time for her because she'd left the umbrella of the other women who were, you know, more high profile at the time than her, to actually lead her own movement in Deptford in southeast London. And so she, in 1928, where things really started to happen, she was giving a talk on her soapbox in Camberwell Green. And a young man called Fred Copeman walked by, who was visiting friends. Fred Copeman was a man from the workhouse who had joined the Navy. And he was on leave, and he was in London, and he was visiting friends in Camberwell, and he overheard Kath Duncan speaking about the power of unions, about the power of the Communist Party, about the power of solidarity. And he was really moved and taken by this debate and became friends with Kath Duncan. Later, he would become one of the leaders of the Invergordon mutiny in Scotland. The Invergordon mutiny is the biggest military mutiny in British history. 15,000 junior naval personnel mutinied. It was extremely successful. They won everything they striked against. It was caused by injustice, where the government wanted to impose heavy taxation on the poor. It was about 28% wage cut on those that were barely surviving already in the Navy. And whereas the admirals and the generals were only getting, 6% cut. So it's a complete injustice issue. But with the backdrop of the First World War, where the German Navy had mutinied, which in part had helped us win the First World War, the British government was terrified. And although all these people were guilty of sedition and all technically should have been hanged, as the law was at that time, the government caved in, and discreetly, when all those sailors and all those leaders came back to London, they were called into the relevant offices and they were all fired one by one. And the government wanted somebody to be responsible for this crisis. So who did they choose? We'll pursue the communists. So they tried to find some linkage to the communists. And Kath Duncan seemed the obvious route. But Fred Copeman said he never ever knew Kath Duncan. It was, somebody else's, agenda. However, when I was researching the book, I discovered that Fred Copeman was on the electoral roll for Kath's house. So when he's being interviewed about his role in the Invergordon Mutiny and the influence of the Communist Party, he was actually lying. And a basic check of electoral roll would have shown that he was living at Kath Duncan's house, which would have meant that technically she was guilty of sedition and could have been hanged in the 1930s. So it's quite extraordinary. We then come on to things like the anti-fascist movement, the rise of the Nazi Party, the rise of fascism, which Kath Duncan was like foremost in trying to end it in many, many different ways. And so when Cable Street happened, which everybody remembers, it was really the Communist Party that led the opposition to Mosley in Cable Street. And it's one of those sort of rare things in working class history that most people accept Cable Street as an important part of history. Unlike the hunger marches in which hundreds of thousands of people took part, it was organized by the Communist Party. Kath Duncan was a leader of the hunger marches along with Fred Copeman. And yet we don't celebrate the hunger marches, which did an incredible amount of activism over 10 years, from 1926 to 1938. But we do remember the Toll Party martyrs. And part of the thing with history is that, again, because of Kath being a communist, part of her history has been erased, and her role in the Cable Street anti-Mosley process has been eradicated. And she needs credit for her role in the anti-fascist movement. When she got involved with the Communist Party, she was one of the first women to be on the committee. She was one of the first working class women to run for Parliament. She stood in Greenwich. And what was quite bizarre about that was that she went to Scotland and helped Willie Gallagher, who was a communist candidate who won in Scotland, campaign. But she didn't campaign for her own seat in Greenwich. In fact, more people put into the pot to pay her deposit to stand for political office than actually voted for her in the general election, in part because, of course, not all working or poor had the vote. And so she didn't win the election, but she's one of the first working class women to stand for political office. And again, she needs recognition for that. She was also actively involved in the leadership of the unemployed workers' union. The hunger marches she played such a huge role in. And after I'd written my book, The Last Queen of Scotland, I also discovered she'd done a lot of work in Ireland, working with the Republican women. She'd also been involved with the miners, because when the Communist Party was building its membership, it was concentrating very, very hard on miners. And a lot of women were leaving the miners' communist branches because they felt the men were not treating them with due respect. And so Kath Duncan was sent around all the mines to the collieries to actually mobilize the women to come back to the Communist Party, and for the men to be more inclusive of the women that were also wanting to have a political voice. When the Spanish Civil War came, Kath Duncan's role was really helping with the interviewing of people that were suitable to go and fight. And Fred Copeman, who was her right-hand man, was very much on side. Although he at this time was seeing another woman, Kitty, I think he probably loved Kath Duncan from the day he met her. I mean, as a gay man writing her story, I fell in love with her from the moment I started writing her story. And what I discovered really was that at the time, the Communist Party was her vehicle. She joined the Communist Party because in the 1930s, that was the most radical party for the poor, for the oppressed, and for the workers. And so that's why she was a communist. when one day in the 1930s, the British Gas Board wanted to bring in a tax on the poor to put up the premiums of what the poor people paid for fuel, Kath Duncan marched 30,000 people on the gasworks on the Old Kent Road against the wishes of the Communist Party. And the Communist Party's view at that time was that this tax would encourage more people to join the revolution. The more you taxed, the more impoverished the poor were, the more likely they would be to join the Communist Party and play an active role. And because Kath Duncan had a social justice agenda and said that this tax is wrong, it's wrong that my people are being charged this wealth tax, that I am going to campaign against it. And so she campaigned against it. But because of her profile and her name nationally, the Communist Party wouldn't throw her out of the party, but they would stop her from being a candidate again and from her holding any party position within the Communist Party. So again, she was principled and put the people before her politics. And again, I think that's something that resonates with us today. Fortunately, because of her association with Clementine Churchill, when the communists were being rounded up the Second World War, Kath Duncan was one of those that wasn't rounded up. But one of the useful things I found when I was writing the book was there was so much information. There were spies outside her house 24/7, recording who she went with, whose car she got in with, what the registration was, where she went, what she ate. So I had like this sort of gold dust of information about her history, which I sort of cover in the book. And both the Russian government, and she went to Russia as part of the TUC delegation, and the Westminster government both tried to recruit her as a spy. The Russians wanted her because of her association with the Churchills, and the British government wanted her as a spy because of her high-profile prominence as a communist. Neither would she accept on principle. And her principle was social justice and end to poverty is what she was about. And that was it. Nobody could buy her in any shape or form. And then she got really sort of involved more organizationally with other issues. So at the time, there was the war going on between Japan and China. And Kath Duncan didn't like war. So she'd lead huge numbers of people from Deptford to Woolwich, and they would lobby the ships sending steel to Japan to make arms. And sometimes she was successful. The dock workers would go on strike and they'd refuse to load the ships. One particular weekend, it was a dreary day, and a police officer was given the job of supervising the march from Deptford to Woolwich and back again. And in those days, there was lots of pubs. And so on every street corner, the inspector stopped and had a pint, then moved to the next and to the next. And by the time he'd got to Woolwich, he'd really had enough of Kath Duncan and all her chanting and the singing of the red flag and all the flags and everything else. And so when they got back from Woolwich back to Deptford, Kath Duncan was still in full voice with the small army of women. And she started singing on Deptford Broadway, the red flag. And the police inspector at the time had had enough by this time. He wanted to go home. It was a Saturday and he'd had enough. And he said, look, you have all got to go. Clear off, the lot of you. And they refused. And so he said, well, I'm going to arrest you all on the basis that you are carrying arms. And what he meant what arms were, they were carrying the poles, you know, the poles with their flags on. Those poles in the eyes of the inspector were weapons. They were weapons, not flag poles. And so Kath Duncan stood in the middle of Deptford Broadway and she sung the red flag. The women who went round her formed a circle and they all sung the red flag. And as they sung the red flag, the police called for reinforcements. And they were attacked by police with batons, police on horseback. And it was a bloodbath at Deptford Broadway. In fact, so many people were arrested and dragged away that all the prisons were full. But Kath Duncan, covered in blood, was protected by the broken bodies of the women that were linked arm in arm around her. And she was still singing and holding the red flag. And in part because of the protection she had from the Churchills, people wouldn't touch Kath Duncan. For days afterwards, the streets were full of, you know, fear, and the state was terrified. There was lots of police, there was lots of reporters, it was well reported in the press. And Kath Duncan's view was, let's stop the violence. So she put stewards on every corner to make sure there was no violence. I'm a peaceful pacifist, I'm anti-violence, I'm anti-war, she would say. We will fight this to the last ditch was her slogan, but that didn't mean that she would actually physically take up arms. And so it led to the Council of Civil Liberties calling for a public meeting, and the unions joined, a number of unions came forward, and the government had started restricting the free movement of free speech. So, for example, a lot of the communists and the union groups were organizing the news at the gates of job centers. You know, they were called test centers then, but we'd call them job centers these days. And so the government tried to stop people within 150 yards of being close to these people to mobilize. And so it was decided that there would be a token case where we would try and take on the state. And so for many weeks, there was different protests at the job centers. The law was ignored, but the government knew that they was being baited, so they ignored it. Until this 1 week at Ninehead Street Test Centre in Deptford. And in Deptford, New Cross, Ninehead Street still exists, although the housing that was there has now been knocked down and it's now social housing. Sadly, there's no plaque. And so Kath Duncan had her soapbox, and she stood on her soapbox, and she was about to make her speech. And they had the lawyers from the Council of Civil Liberties there, they had the unions there, they had all their reps. But that day they had an officer who was his first day in promotion. He'd just been given an extra stripe. And so he was like, Mr. I will follow the word of law. And so he said, you cannot speak, you're in breach of the law. I'm not allowing you to speak. And so Kath Duncan climbed onto that box, and she was immediately arrested and dragged away. And at the time, they didn't really know what to charge her with because she hadn't said anything. And the law forbidding anybody to be within 150 yards was very vague. So they ended up using a 14th century act of, you know, treason against the king. And they took her to court in Tower Bridge. And word got to the judge at Tower Bridge that on all accounts, do not jail Kath Duncan, do not jail Kath Duncan. And Kath Duncan straight away said, on what authority do you have to charge me? And they said, the state. And Kath Duncan said, but it's not law yet. So they had to bring the minister responsible to the magistrate's court in order to lay the charges against Kath Duncan. So originally, she was showing power that was not normal with an ordinary working class woman. So the judge said, you know, it took over a week, the trial, and the judge decided that she was guilty, but he wasn't going to sentence her. So he said, if you agreed to be quiet and give 6 months assurance that you will keep the peace, I will not send you to the jail. And Kath Duncan, they needed this case, they needed this martyr. And Kath Duncan said, no, I will not give this assurance. I'll always speak out against injustice and civil rights. And so what happened was that she was sent to Holloway. She was given 12 months jail in Holloway prison. But on the way to the prison, some way, the paperwork got switched and she was only given a month jail sentence. So by the time the courts and the papers were reporting 12 months, with that short journey from Tower Bridge to Holloway, it had been reduced to 4 weeks charge. And the prison were going crazy because they're having this high profile woman going into prison. They didn't know what to do. And the media was screaming injustice. And so at that moment, the Council of Civil Liberties, as it was called then, realized that Kath Duncan's role in this movement was the defining factor in the civil rights movement in Britain. So it was the first civil rights case fought by the Council of Civil Liberties. And in order to change to give it the power of the court that they wanted, they changed their organization's name. And from that moment, it became the National Council of Civil Liberties, which we call Liberty today. And that came about because of the power of Kath Duncan and the profile she gave to the movement. That led to George Lansbury having the first civil rights debate in the House of Commons. And Kath Duncan was often referred to in the House of Commons. The MPs knew her association with Sir Winston Churchill, so they would joke about his relationship. She was the red herring. She was, Kath Bunkum. There was lots of, terminologies. They expected her to be in the House of Commons. But in Holloway Prison, she caught TB, and that would be what would lead to her death, a slow, painful death. Sandy caught tongue cancer and died a miserable death in Glasgow. Kath Duncan died a very slow, painful death of TB. But in the 1940s, because of her work with the Spanish Civil War, she became good friends with Clem Attlee, who, through Fred Copeman, became part of her network. And Clem Attlee was the Jeremy Corbyn of his time. He was loved by the people, but hated by his parliamentary group. And so Kath Duncan worked with him on the 1945 Party Manifesto. And it's quite interesting that the Party Manifesto of 1917 of both the both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party consisted of policies that were mainstream to the Communist Party in 1931. So by 2017, the Communist Party policies had become mainstream, which is quite extraordinary in itself. In 1999, women on their way to Greenham Common were stopped en route in a coach, and the grounds they were stopped were the arrest of Kath Duncan, her court case, Jones versus Duncan. And although she lost the case on the grounds that she was preaching sedition under the law at the time, she was found guilty of that. There was no defense. The law after 1999, when these women were stopped from taking part in the protest, that led to the end of the Jones versus Duncan law being changed. And so when I talk about Kath Duncan, there's lots of women we know that did different things. And I tried to sort of skip through as much as I can because she was involved with so much. But she did the hunger marches, she did the anti-fascist movement, the Spanish Civil War, slum landlords, LGBT, the civil rights, the suffragette movement, anti-war. There is no woman or man in British history in the past 100 years who played such a high leadership role as Kath Duncan. And it is shameful today that all that she has to show that is now a Wikipedia page, is a park bench in Deptford. There's no recognition in Scotland. She came from Kirkcaldy. We remember Adam Smith. I would argue Kath Duncan's role in history is as great as Adam Smith, and yet she's not recognised in the working class areas of Scotland. And my play still struggles to go on tour. And my book, The Last Queen of Scotland, that tells her story, should be in every library. Every child should know this story. It's about an extraordinary woman who was ordinary when she started, but through events became extraordinary. And how many other women out there like Kath Duncan? And so now I lead the Kath Duncan Equality and Civil Rights Movement, and that supports grassroots groups around the world. So we work in refugee camps in Lesbos in Greece, we work with LGBT in Uganda, and we're working in Yemen. So we're working all around, as well as running food banks. There's a film online called Feeding Lewisham, which you can see on my website, which I made about my work with my food bank, which is a model for other people to copy. And I'm on ITV Tonight program tomorrow night, Thursday at 7:30, about my work tackling poverty. And all of that has become possible because I'm inspired and in love with this woman called Kath Duncan. So please buy this book. Give every person you know that loves powerful women, who is inspired by real working class history of this book. And let's get people talking about Kath Duncan. Let's get her, at the foremost of Pride festivals, at the foremost of not just LGBT history, but woman's history. Yes, she was poor. Yes, she was working class. Yes, she was queer. Yes, she was a communist. But does that make her a woman unworthy of her role in history? I think not. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your powerful advocacy on behalf of Kath. Truly an invisible history. This is a label that we have given our talks for many years now, but there are so many stories which are untold or little told, and this is clearly a case in point. That is a great, I appreciate a gallop through her life, because you did say to me that you often talk for an hour and a half, so we appreciate the gallop, and we would certainly encourage people to go to the links that I've put in the chat to get the book, to find out more about the play. I can see now how a play works as well, with all the drama of the different parts of her life. I'd encourage people to ask questions at this point via the chat function. We've got people commenting, Ray, about Felicia Brown and questioning her as trans. So that's something that I can follow up and send you the chat, etc. And that's something. But if we could focus on Kath Duncan for the minute, at least, because clearly that's your main focus today. I'm intrigued that she carry on teaching when she came to London.
She carried on teaching for about 27 years, but in those days you had to have permission to get married, so she had to get marriage permission. And then when she became arrested, it meant that they tried to take her teacher's license away. And then the unions lobbied and managed to get her reinstated. And then the House of Commons had a debate about why was Kath Duncan being treated differently to any other working class protester. And so she was fired again. So it ended up that she was unable to teach and became a full-time campaigner. Her mother, who stayed with her the whole period and lived in London, died at the age of 90. Kath Duncan died at the age of 64. And it's very difficult with her sexuality. What I was trying to do with those times is, of course, you're working from history, and we only had 3 terminologies. We had homosexuality, and we had transvestites. So when we use the language we have today, it's very different. So when I was writing about Kath Duncan, it was very difficult for me to say where she was on the trans, on the LGBT agenda, to be fair to her. Was she a lesbian? Was there another scale? And then when I staged my play in London, I had 2 former communist comrades that came to my play in London. And one of them, a guy called John White, who's 99. At the end of the play, the cast came out all in their 1930s clothes. And Emily Carding, who played the role of Kath Duncan, actually wearing the hat that she wore in the 1930s, came out and held his hand. And I said to John, how was the play? How accurate was it for me as an activist writing this type of work? And he said, John, you took me back, Ray, you took me back to where I was in the 1930s. This is me with my comrades. Your portrayal of Kath was accurate. And I said, and was she a queer activist? He said, yeah, we all knew it, but we couldn't talk about it. It wasn't something you talked about. And Kath didn't want people talking about it. For Kath, it was her activism. And the same, me, I'm gay, but I don't see myself as a gay activist. My mantra is tackling inequality, trying to stop the misery of homelessness, ending poverty. Those are my issues. The fact I'm a gay man is irrelevant. A lot of people are defined because they're a gay man that fights for gay history or gay campaigns. I think that as human beings, we have to be beyond that. And with Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter, free school meals, and Minister for Poverty, what we've actually learned from this pandemic is really we're all anarchists. We all have the power when we're united as people. And I think that's one of the great things that we should take out of the pandemic, is that the power of community, the power of what we have as individuals. And I know everything seems so large and you don't really know how to start, but sometimes just tweeting from your bed in support of somebody else can actually be life-saving. And we sometimes forget the power we have as individuals because everything seems so global, when actually we do as individuals have a huge amount of power.
And a lot of the stories in the Working Class Movement Library certainly bear that out. We have a lot about the hunger marches, we have a lot about anti-fascism, And again, I put a couple of links in the chat about that, but certainly we've got on the window, it says explore the past, change the future. And we're certainly very keen that people understand working class history in order to, as you absolutely say, do something about situations now and future situations. And Charlotte Hughes, whom you gave a name check to right at the start there, is a good friend to the library. So we're delighted to know that she's featured. I'll make sure she knows that she's featured in your talk today. She'll be thrilled. Okay, does anyone want to wave at me with a question? I'll move to gallery view if anybody has anything they want to ask. Eleanor, yes, would you like to unmute yourself? Okay, it should.
Yes, I'm okay.
Yeah.
I'm not really asking a question, but just commenting in that my mother was very active in the Communist Party, and I can remember going once down to near Clevedon to a woman called Doris Hatt, who was a communist and a lesbian and very active sort of in that. And I can remember not feeling shocked at all, you know, I mean, it wasn't an issue. But what she did do is she was an artist, she did paintings, but she also did other work. And I've actually got a tray, a silver tray, sort of with, which has got engraving, well, more than engraving, but of two women looking at each other and kissing each other. So that's just sort of, and I keep, you know, and I remember, so she was not only sort of as an artist sort of taking her sex, was nothing to do, had to be separate. It was very much part of her that there's these two women looking very closely together and about to kiss each other. It's beautiful, it's beautiful.
Thanks, Eleanor. Gordon is raised his hand. Do you want to unmute yourself, Gordon?
Yes. Am I unmuted?
You are.
Yeah, right. I find it absolutely fascinating, and was surprised to have not been aware of in the working class movement. One should have been aware of people, a lot of people around Scotland and during the 30s that one had never heard of her. You mentioned about the thing about getting your play shown and trying to get it at church hall. And you mentioned there's still the basically anti-gay rhetoric among some churches. I'm a Quaker, and said you might have tried Friends Meeting House, and you'd have probably been able to get access to that. Even within church movements, the churches together in England, Hannah Brock-Womack was our representative, and she was in a revolving president with 6 sections, and she became the 4th president of the 4th section, and she was in the same-sex marriage. And because of objections from other churches, she did not take that role up, and they left the seat vacant. That was only a couple of years ago. You also mentioned civil rights, and there was one gay man particularly involved in civil rights in America, who again was a Quaker, and that was Bayard Rusty. And he was very much, so the purpose Duncan did, he was very much the strategist and did a lot of the tactics. But he's very little heard of, and part of that reason is basically because he was gay.
Yeah. I think it's a really, really big issue that we have. I'm not just saying this on a gay perspective, but I think there's a real injustice. And before I was doing this one, I was doing one for an African Black Lives interview, and I was doing an interview on this subject. And the issue really is, to me, is not about gay women. The issue to me is about women generally that have not had their role in history recognised in the way they should. And I agree there's many gay men. We hear of gay men that were famous for one thing or another, but actually activism, which actually changes lives, is something that's not really up there in any way. I mean, if you become rich and successful, or you're a pop star, or you build a lovely building, then you get some sort of recognition. But if through your activism, you save lives, somehow you don't get any recognition. And this year, it'd be interesting to see how many lives have been saved by the impact of Marcus Rushford, highlighting the starvation that some people are having by not having access to food. But would he get a statue? Would he be recognized? Probably not, because even though we have over 12 million people in poverty before this crisis, and they now say it's closer to 15 million, we still cannot get anybody globally to support my campaign to get a minister for poverty. That's not, some would argue that all the Tories are responsible for poverty. But my argument is, if we spend as much time tackling COVID with all these ministers for COVID, councillors for COVID, if we change those to appoint them to deal with poverty, because let's face it, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, globally, more people die of the impact of poverty than ever will of COVID. And yet, why is it we still are too shamed or too proud, or to say we've got to have a cohesive strategy to end poverty? And whether you're rich or poor or whatever, we have to be less selective as to who we think is worthy. And I think the pandemic showed us we recognise our nurses, we recognise our care workers, but we also need to recognise our activists that do extraordinary work that have not been recognised, apart from, the Pankhurst, case because of the suffragette movement. You will still struggle. And even the suffragette movement is distorted. You've got to remember that we generally don't celebrate the time when all women got the vote, but when some women got the vote. And I'd argue the real victory was when all women got the vote, not when a handful got the vote, i.e. the rich that were most likely to vote Conservative at the time. So I think that history has been written by white men, and I'm guilty of that myself. But I think as an activist writing, and I'm dyslexic as well, so writing is very difficult for me. I think I have that perspective as an activist that I understand the people I write about and can write it in a way that it's not just methodical. It's not just a press clipping that I've written and presumed. When I wrote Kath Duncan about her sexuality, it wasn't until I wrote the book, when I put all the clues together, that I realized that something was amiss. I didn't write the book thinking she was, a gay activist. I wrote the book because she was an extraordinary woman and with a story that needed to be told. And the fact that I was a gay man and she'd lived in my street was something I didn't discover until I'd written the book. So it's extraordinary, really, how life changes and so many doors open when you become a writer. Becoming a writer opens the doors. When you're an activist, you're always an activist. But suddenly when you become an author or a playwright, it's quite extraordinary the doors that is opened to me to bring real change and to make some extraordinary things happen. So again, it's Kath Duncan that's inspired me, that keeps me going. And I hope through me, she lives on, but also through me, I raise awareness like all you guys, and you guys will tell everybody else about Kath Duncan. And we will, through social media and the recording of this talk, at least ensuring future generations, people will be able to research and discover something about Kath Duncan. Because, remember, we didn't have social media back there. Now we have it. Now we can record everything. And so for people going forward, at least they can find the stories of inspirational women. There's still lots more to write about. There's still more women to know more about, but hopefully other people will take up that call.
Yeah, the library does have a copy of the CP in Deptford's pamphlet about Kath Duncan. That's the only thing that we have directly about her, but people are very welcome once we're back open to come and read that, of course, as well as we need to get a copy of Ray's book, clearly. I've made a note, Ray, don't worry, I'll be doing it. And yes, in 2028, we will certainly not be forgetting the fact that that is the centenary of all women getting the vote, as Sam J has also just flagged up to us. Okay, Rafe, you've been waiting patiently there. Would you like to unmute to ask a question?
Okay, so basically I'm I'm a first year student at the University of Winchester, and somewhat, and we have this this sort of this student support network for LGBT plus students, which is called Spectrum. And someone reached out to reached a youth ambassador for English Heritage Young Producer Scheme reached out to us, and they were basically asking sort of what sort of we would like to see from English heritage, and just like history and how history is told, basically at sort of like in terms of like LGBTQ figures and stuff, and individuals in history, how it should be told. So I was thinking of possibly like mentioning Kath Duncan to them, but I'm just sort of wondering if anyone wanted to give any suggestions in how best to put that to them. So whether to, basically that. So so like sort of hearing the meeting today, I think I might put that forward to them to see if they can try and provide more history, but especially if it's something that's not covered. Yeah.
That's a really good question, but it's like, I'm glad as a young person that you're interested. I think young people are really, really interested. But the trouble is they've got to have the tools in order to access that information. And I think universities need to take on more. I also find it extraordinary that our legal system teaches people international civil rights law, but doesn't teach people about the laws within our own UK and about those struggles. Even people like Peter Factual aren't recognised in British law and does extraordinary things. So I think that the role of the law and universities is really important in addressing injustice. I mean, Scotland's just doing a thing now on LGBT history to put it into the curriculum, which is great. But what I fear is what role and what is the content of that LGBT history? How do they define LGBT history? And I think if they can't even in Scotland do their own work at the basic level on Kath Duncan, how are they going to teach wider LGBT history in their classrooms? So if you need any help with anything, if anybody needs any follow-up, contact me through the website. I'm happy to give talks, give links, give any information you need to help you with anything you need to do to get the story out.
Great, that's brilliant. Thumbs up there from Rafe. If you want to get in touch with us as well, you're welcome to do that. If you want other people to get in touch with you with other suggestions, stick your contact details in the chat now and other people can note it down. But I think we're probably winding down here unless anybody else wants to wave at me. Right, there is Maria, you're waving. Hang on, there you go. Can you unmute yourself?
Actually, Margaret Cohen's been sticking a hand up for a while, so maybe take Margaret first.
No, you go ahead. I'll go to Maggie next. Yeah.
Thank you. Ray, thank you for raising this profile of a working class lesbian. I mean, I was really impressed with that. As a working class black dyke, I'm very conscious that we just don't exist virtually anywhere in terms of a profile. And when I think about my own relationships, it's been class that's been the biggest challenge within that. So class permeates virtually every aspect of our life. So I'm really pleased to do that. I did a talk recently for Rainbow Noir, which is a Manchester-based queer black group, ethnic minority group, around being a lesbian, a black dyke prior to 2000. We existed before then, sort of thing. So I'm quite happy to pass that on also to the Working Class Movement Library. One question I had though was around the legal position of lesbians, because as I understand it, being a lesbian has not been illegal. I've not seen a legislation that relates to that. I know for gay men that obviously was a real bugbear on their lives for many a long year. Was there something specific to Scotland that made it illegal to be a lesbian?
with Kath Duncan, it was the political climate more than anything else. So it was very difficult. I mean, I was, you know, a gay young man growing up in the 70s and 80s with AIDS, and I struggled. I had to run away to London to be who I was. So that was relatively recent. In Kath's situation and Duncan, they wanted their politics. And in lots of the press coverage of Kath Duncan during the 30s and 40s, they talk about Kath Duncan almost referring to her being a lesbian, but where they hold back by saying, but of course she couldn't possibly be because she's married to Mr. Sandy Duncan. And so the marriage, like with many, was a marriage of convenience, so that she wasn't known as that queer woman. She was known as that activist woman. And that's what that's my take of why she moved to London, to be more open with her sexuality, and also to be, to focus around her issues. She didn't just want to be a queer activist. Women's rights, you know, disability, housing, poverty, whatever your gender or faith, they were all impacting on you. And so she didn't want to be boxed in that small way. And so that's why in the book, I don't highlight too much on her sexuality, because I don't think that's what she was about. It was about the wider issues of injustice.
Okay, but there wasn't such a legal prohibition. Thank you.
No.
Okay, thanks, Maria. Maggie, I apologise, I hadn't seen you waving. Would you like to unmute yourself? No, you're still mute, Maggie. Okay, there's a button there that should be asking you to unmute. If you press that.
There we are, it's done it now.
There you go.
Yeah. Okay, yes.
We can hear you.
Yes, that's been a really, really interesting talk. Thank you very much indeed. I was interested when just you mentioned how now as a gay man, and probably for about the last 20 years, 10, 20 years, you see, you know, people expect you to be active in gay campaigns, but broader campaigns somehow, you know, became less fashionable, didn't they? So if you were a gay man, that if you were lesbian, if you were a communist, you'd be narrow. It was narrower somehow. It became narrower, and although people did gain individually or in as small as groups more liberty in many ways and more tolerance, it stopped the forward march. I mean, seeing the role of class in access to all sorts of things became less prominent than this role of you as being a member of a particular group, rather than a broader thing. So you were much more effective if you joined with a wider groups of people to campaign somehow, and it seemed to be something that was very good for the haves rather than the have-nots, or for keeping people, you know, for stopping really social changes, but more fundamental social changes. And I wondered how you sort of when you felt you were beginning to experience this, being active in gay, you know, you should as a gay man be active in gay campaigns, and what you feel has been the effects on us wanting to campaign for broader social justice and economic justice.
It's a really good point. There's three quick points on that. One of them is, you're right, in the 80s, we were split in two ways. There was like the minor, gays, you know, and lesbians support the minors, and there was also AIDS, and I was an AIDS activist. You know, all my friends were dying of AIDS. I had been abused as a child, so I was not physically active in that way. So although I was gay, I didn't partake in any physicality. And that probably saved my life, but lots of my friends died. So that really started through my AIDS. And now today, during the COVID crisis, what I learned in AIDS, so the buddy system, I've copied into my life. So on my website, you'll see my movie Feeding Lucia, which I made during the lockdown. And what I learned from AIDS was a buddy system. So when the lockdown came in March, I matched all my volunteers to people in isolation. So single mums in tower block, pensioners in sheltered housing. I matched them and created bubbles. And by doing that, I was able to feed and look after 5,000 people during lockdown, 5,000, without any government or council support. And I've learned that through my AIDS activism, being aware protection because of AIDS, and people were terrified of transmission, great pandemic. And so I learned that young activism I translated into the present pandemic. And on the other issue, the wider issue about activism generally, I think the class has become a really disillusional issue, I think part because of our education system. I think that people now are not left and right the way that we used to be. People see campaigns. This is why, who would have thought that, Dennis Skinner would have lost his seat to a Tory? The reality is that the world we live in today, people see issues, whether it's like Black Lives Matter or free school meals or refugees welcome, which are anything but in reality welcome. These are people's movements now, and young people in particular, whether it's Extinction Rebellion or climate change, they don't see themselves as a class. They see themselves as people of the planet. And I think that the whole issue around class, left and right, and even gender to extent is changing. And one of the things I find the most disturbing as a gay activist politically is how toxic trans is. I have women that, trans friends of mine. I did a lot of work in the 70s and 80s with George, who became Julia, merchant seaman who had his sex change operation filmed on the BBC. It was very dramatic at the time. I did his PR for that. So I'd worked with trans very early on, and it was not as toxic and poisonous as it is today. If you talk about trans in any shape or form, you are closed down and shut down, and you can't have a really good debate about it. And it saddens me because I love women, I love people that are trans, and that conflict I find very uncomfortable. And the new politics, as I said at the start, really, I think we're really now all anarchists. Most people associate themselves as socialists. But what I've learned from this pandemic is the way we all help each other without any union support, without any power of organizational structure. The most powerful thing we have is your neighbor or each other. And I think that's a lasting change. And I think globally now, I think, the change of Corbyn did do amazing things for Labour. I mean, that policy agenda was extraordinarily brave, and we really need it now. We lost it just where we were so close. But I think that there's going to be a new type of politics, and I'm fearful that the right will control the media, and those on the left will be, as we always are, so split up and segmented that we will not be able to organise. And so the power will go back to the right. And that's what I fear about. So I think that the future is not through a party political system, but I think it's a localised community, one-on-one type of power, where we find what's important to each other and we work on that. That's what I see the future is. I don't believe we will have a Labour government in my lifetime now. And I don't believe we will have a socialist government in my lifetime. We had the chance with Corbyn, it didn't happen for all sorts of reasons, and I'm sad for it. But, I have to be a realist. And on my social media, I try to live outside the bubble. I have friends that are communists, that are socialists, left and right. And it's really important as a writer that I understand how people voted Brexit, why they did, why they didn't, and understand those reasons. And a lot of it isn't about hate or bigotry or ignorance. A lot of it is neglect and poor communities not having a voice. And that's why around the world at the moment, the areas where the right are strongest are in the areas where the people are the poorest and where supposed left councils have actually taken the poor for granted for too long. And that's why food banks have spiraled, why you have all sorts of different movements that are now run by people and not by organizations. And I'm hoping that the unions notice this. And we do need unions at the moment. The need for a union has never been greater. And yet their relevance, I think, has not been generated enough through the platforms to understand the importance of being in a union, what a union can bring to you and offer you, and the security that a united left can bring us. And I don't know how we can do that. And so for me, I concentrate on the small things I can, running my food bank, giving support network where I can, and do my work through Kath Duncan, and then writing, speaking to people like you, in the hope that you don't feel alone and you feel that there's other people out there, even if you can't, doing the things you would if you were able to.
Thank you. Despite the sad bits of the message you were giving there, there's clearly major positives as well, and we certainly do thank you very much for having been part of our community here today, and it's brought new people in, which is fantastic, and we do hope that people will want to come back again. Ray found others who may be here for the first time. We'd love to hear more from you. Thanks everybody for your contributions. That's been fantastic. It's all noted in the chat. All the things there get recorded and sent on to us, so it's all there. But we particularly do want to thank, of course, Ray for giving his time. He's had another 2 talks to give today, so this is his 3rd. I can't believe your energy levels. I can see why you're attracted to Kath Duncan from that point of view, just on the energy levels alone. So that's brilliant, Ray, and everybody is, if only they could say, give you a round of applause at this point, they certainly would. So I will just draw to a close by reminding you that our talk has been recorded. So if you joined us late, we're going to be uploading it to our YouTube channel shortly. That's youtube.com/WCM Library. So do please spread the word about that. And next week, that's Wednesday, the 17th of February, we'll be looking a little further back in time as we welcome Matthew Kidd, and he'll be speaking on the topic, the renewal of radicalism, politics, identity and ideology in England, 1867 to 1924. A reminder that our talks are, as usual, free. However, we would like to encourage you to support the library if you're able to do so, and there is a donate button on our website. Thanks again and goodbye until the same time next week. We hope to see you. Take care, in solidarity, very best wishes from all at the Working Class Movement Library. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.